Podot. Welcome to A Pod Too Far, where we relive 1980s Sunday afternoons spent watching old war movies. Today we strap on our flying helmets and leap up and down joyfully shouting racial abuse as we watch the 1955 low-flying classic, The Dam Busters. I'm Rob Hutton. I write jokes about politics and rather more serious books about military history, and I'm joined by Duncan Weldon.
And I write books about economics and history.
The Dam Busters. It's just 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. I saw earlier when I was doing some basic research. People love this film. 60 years old, people absolutely still love it. Do you have any sense of when it sort of entered your consciousness, or has it just always been there?
The theme music will have entered my consciousness well before I saw the film, in that the theme music, I don't know if it still is, was absolute classic primary school disco music.
No.
Maybe this was just my school. They used to play the.
What does one dance?
You just put your arms out and pretend to be a plane, swaying around to the Dam Busters.
The girls do this too.
They did, and I'm now really, really worried this was something that only happened at my school.
I don't think we had a disco at my school, I have to say, but we did play Dam Busters in the disco. I mean, you could tell when it had been on, because people would be doing the run across the playground.
Yeah, so we'd have. So I was probably aware of the music before I saw the film, and then it was just one of those classic. I mean, it's absolutely classic Saturday or Sunday afternoon. BBC Two or Channel 4 black and white war movie.
It's made in 1955, still very, very close to the war. They're using actual RAF pilots to fly actual Lancasters. So they're nominated for an Oscar for special effects on this film. And I think we have to say that the special effects fall into two categories, which are, by the standards of 2022, laughably bad, and then all of the scenes with the Lancasters, which are just, oh my goodness, they've got 3 Lancasters. They're flying 3 Lancasters really low.
But the guy that did the special effects photography on the Dam Busters.
Yes. Tell me about the guy.
Well, the guy that did the special effects photography for the Dam Busters was then the director of photography for Star Wars in 1977. And if you look at the Death Star trench run in Star Wars and New Hope, it's just the Dam Busters. It is.
So there is on YouTube, and it's worth, if you Google Star Wars and Dam Busters, and you can see the sort of the two films cut together. And it's absolutely amazing. And in fact, when George Lucas has done I think principal photography on Star Wars, but hasn't yet done all the special effects, and he's showing it to Steven Spielberg or whatever, and all of his mates in the mid-70s. The way that he showed them what the sort of the X-Wing bits would be like is by cutting in old war movies presumably actually cutting in quite a lot of the Dam Busters. And you absolutely, and actually the Star Wars trench run guidance computer closing in on is absolutely classic of the Dam Busters run along the dam.
Maybe I can get my children to watch Dam Busters by explaining the Star Wars link. That's just occurred to me.
Yeah, no, well, you see, I mean, I think I did make my children watch Dam Busters. I didn't make them watch it this time, but I have made them watch it in the past. I have shown them that supercut, but it's just another of your old war films, Dad. But it's 1955. So one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is I have a sort of operating theory that British war movies after the war are. They're the stories that we're telling ourselves about who we are. It's not just that they used to be on every Saturday and Sunday in the 80s. It's that these sort of are our national myth.
Yeah, the modern canon.
I was doing some actual research. There's a fantastic essay that Dilys Powell, who was a sort of film critic from pretty much the moment they started making films, she writes in about 1947, 1948, so really quite close after the war. Before the war, she'd written, I have this problem that there is no such thing really as a British film, she said. I mean, which is interesting because Hitchcock has made a load. But she said, there's French films, and you can see when you're watching a French film, you're watching a French film. But there's no such thing as a British film. And after the war, she says, British films are now about the war. That's what we're making films about. And she's saying that, as I say, sort of before 1950. Looking back at it now, it's absolutely clear that this is, if you picture John Mills in his prime, he's wearing uniform. Yeah. All of these guys, they are made in endless sort of films about the desert, films about pilots. The Dam Busters is arguably the king of them. It features very heavily in... I'm not a massive Pink Floyd fan. Are you a massive Pink Floyd fan?
I'm not a huge Pink Floyd fan, but I know where you're going with this.
Right, well, perhaps you should explain this, actually, because it features very heavily in The Wall.
Yes.
I think it's being watched on a loop.
Yeah.
Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, his father died in the war, killed in Italy in, I think, 44. This is a generation that are growing up where this is absolutely... I mean, the war is... They didn't fight in the war, but the war is their lived experience in some strange kind of way. And they're reliving it in their day, probably, at sort of Saturday afternoon matinees. And then they're reliving it with their children. Yeah. Us. I'm not actually related to Roger Waters. But so far as I know, they're reliving it with their children on TV in the 80s. And that's my grand theory of Britain and the war and cinema.
This is one of the cool movies in that.
Yes, absolutely.
Within 10 years of the war, genre defining almost.
There's a lot to talk about. We're going to go to the after action report. We're going to do it slightly out of order because I think the thing we have to talk about watching this is the Dam Busters Dog Award for the most problematic moment in this film.
So I rewatched the film last night, and I rewatched it on a train with my headphones in, thankfully. And, I hadn't seen it for... this film I've seen so many times, but I hadn't seen it for maybe 7 or 8 years. And I was really quite shocked. More than I remember, that dog's name comes up.
The dog is... It's a black Labrador.
And it has just about the worst possible name you could give.
It has a name that we're not going to be saying.
Yes.
we're not going to be saying.
But which they say an awful lot in their film.
But they don't say so much. I sort of knew it, because I'd sort of, in my mind, it's like, once or twice.
Yes, mine too.
But it's not. It's, my goodness, it's all the time.
But this is
He just keeps shouting it, and other people shout. And there's this scene where one person after another says it. And I was watching it on my sofa on my own in my house with my black poodle, in fact. And it's just like, shut up, stop saying the dog's name.
I'm going to say it again. I'm pleased I had my headphones in on the train. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because Peter Jackson wants to remake this film. And in fact, he was due to remake it before he got sidetracked into making, for some reason, 3 versions of The Hobbit. But, the question people keep asking is, how are you going to... It's the only question people ask. This is, here you've got a film which has, as you've told me, a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is regarded as an absolute classic of British filmmaking, and you want to remake it. And the only question people ask is, how are you going to deal with the dog's name?
Again, in fact, people change people's names. When we were doing A Bridge Too Far, James Caan's character's name, I think, is not the real name for some reason. No, I think they just changed his first name. I don't even know why. Yeah. You can change people's names in actual people. Yeah. In films of true life events.
You can just change the dog's name.
You can change the dog's name. Apparently, they are going to change it to, I think, Digger.
There we go.
Digger, which is
not
what they shout in the 1955 film.
No, but actually,
loads and loads of times.
I rewatched it on. I streamed it and downloaded it and watched it on train last night, my way back from an event. But is it still shown on television? And how do they deal with the dog's name?
I mean, the answer is lots of different ways. So some people just cut it, and then it makes no sense. I think. Sorry, we should pause for a moment and just explain to. First of all, I have no idea whether Guy Gibson was a massive racist or not. There's no particular reason to think that he was any more racist than
this
any
was
other.
Apparently a common name for dogs. Yeah.
Yes. In Britain was not America. We didn't have plantations here. I'm not defending it. Yeah. It's obviously not a word it's obviously not a word we're going to be using on the podcast, but it's a slightly different context. Yeah. It was obviously not offensive to anyone in 1950. There's at no stage in 1955 making of this. Yeah. Does someone sit there and say, maybe we should just change, which would have been the time to change. If they'd called the dog Digger then, we'd never have known, and it would have been an amusing fact on podcasts like this. It's not just that it's his dog's name and he shouts it loads and loads of other people say it, and it's not just that the dog actually sort of has an important sort of narrative, is an important part of the narrative. It's that it's actually one of the code words that they use for successfully blowing up a dam. So there is a moment 3/4 of the way through this film in which an RAF officer jumps up and shouts
the word.
Sir! And everyone cheers. and at that moment, you're sort of...
Hence the question to Peter Jackson, what are you going to call the dog?
This
is the thing. The dog is not just... it's not just that there is a dog in a scene at the back, which gets referred to once or twice. This is quite an important part of the story.
So sometimes they cut it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they dub it.
Yeah.
No one has ever quite successfully worked out what to do with it. I mean, it's now shown. I imagine you, like me, sort of downloaded it on Amazon. It's now shown with a big warning at the front saying, "Look, different times and historical authenticity and that sort of thing." And the Dan Buster's Dog Award for the most problematic moment in this film
self-awarding
goes to the Dan Buster's dog. There's no getting away from it. It definitely is not intended as a racial slur.
No.
I think that's
important. Yeah.
I think that it probably is reflective of attitudes in Britain in the 1950s, which are not attitudes in Britain. Certainly not the attitudes in this podcast. I can tell you that. So there we are. And I actually have a theory that the reason they haven't made the film is because they can't work out what to do about the dog.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Whatever they decide to do with the dog, they are going to get condemned.
Yes, well,
there are going to be newspapers that say, you're rewriting history, this is woke nonsense if they change the dog's name. And if they don't change the dog's name, they're going to have a problem getting it shown in lots of cinemas. But anyway, I think stop talking about the dog.
Well, the only thing I would add to it is I think that I would have more sympathy with the woke nonsense stuff if I had not watched it and thought, oh my goodness, it's really awful. Honestly, guys, if you're not sure whether it's awful, watch it. Possibly not with your children, definitely not with your headphones off. Apart from Guy Gibson getting out of his plane and shouting racial abuse, what's the cable car moment? What do you call your people in from the other room for?
It's the finale, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's the last hour, basically. Yeah. So I think this depends on whether your dad is an engineer. Because I think that my dad probably enjoys the first hour more. This is basically two films.
Yeah.
And the first hour is lots of men in suits trying to work out how to make a bomb bounce and having meetings about whether it's possible to make a bomb bounce. And you see so many men in suits.
Yeah.
And Barnes Wallis, played by Michael Redgrave, desperately, this sort of idyllic life, desperately trying to work out how to make a bomb bounce. And then the second half of it is the Star Wars bombing run. Yeah. Which is, totally nail-biting.
And filmed with real Lancaster bombers flying low, and it's just
people could actually have been killed in the filming of this.
I do like that frisson of danger.
Yes. So I think actually the moment at which I would want to be called in is and this is a great shot, where they're all the pilots and the aircrew are lounging around and they're playing cricket in the sunshine and they're playing, and it's beautiful, and it sort of pans across them. And in the background, you notice Gibson and Barnes Wallis coming out, and then Gibson says, "Come on, lads, I think it's time to go."
Yeah.
And they all get in, and then you realise that you've been listening to the march, and the march surges, the music surges, and they all climb into the vans to go to their planes. That is the moment at which you could almost skip the first hour, unless you're an engineer and you're really interested in... The other film I watched this week, actually with my dad, was the new Top Gun film, Top Gun Maverick, which is also a trench run.
Yeah.
A trench run to tricky bombing target.
Yeah. Doesn't have the Arabat engineers, though.
No, it doesn't. No. But it's interesting that the second hour of this film, obviously it is then kind of copied in 633 Squadron. It's copied in Star Wars. It's a very, very influential hour. She's not so dumb. Women in the film. Well, there's one really, which is Mrs. Wallis. Yeah, who seems sort of perfectly nice. It's odd, and I don't know if it's deliberate. The Barnes Wallis home life is absolutely idyllic.
Yes.
And, the children scampering around, and, when he thinks he's lost his job, I'll go and I'll fix the door on the shed, and I'll need to work on the chicken run and stick another log on the fire, and all of that, and she's sitting there darning a sock. This is very much a film in which men won the war.
Yes,
I think men win the war, and women
either by flying planes dramatically or by attending meetings in suits and planning bombs,
being tremendously clever. Yeah. Which I think is the other. So I think in 1955 it's important to Britain. And this is a film that enjoys huge government support. This is Britain telling itself.
Although at the time it was made, lots of the details of the bomb were still classified. And apparently this causes all sorts of issues in the filming. Because it's 10 years after. It's the height of the Cold War. The RAF has still got squadrons based in Europe. We think they might have to do this sort of thing.
We might need to bounce a bomb along a Russian fjord or something.
Exactly, yeah. So they struggle to show... because they don't want to give away too much about the bouncing bomb. Which, when you've got a film in which the first hour is about making the bouncing bomb, is quite hard.
But the message they want to say is, we won the war by brains and pluck.
Yes.
We men won the war by brains and pluck, while women provided tea and handed over cocoa and darned socks. And get the GP to come out and visit you at home. I mean, the least plausible moment in this film, from a 2022 perspective, is a GP making a home visit and stopping for a chat to see how you are.
Yes.
I mean, having spent 10 hours overnight in A&E last week with a small child, I do not believe.
That's the moment I turned off.
I lost it from me. I didn't watch it after the first scene. The casualty list. The movie body count, 56 people died in this operation. 56 RAF officers, and nobody else dies in this film. Nobody else died. There are no other deaths in this film. Nobody died. No Germans. No Germans died in this Operation Chastise. 56 pilots. Is that right?
Well, it's not quite right, is it? I mean, the film sort of, when you sort of step back, this is a film about trying to destroy some dams to flood an area to hit German where people lived, hit German production. So Operation Chastise, May 1943, the raid on the dams. We don't know how many people are killed. The best modern estimate is something like 1,600 civilians, mainly, of whom quite a few will have been Russian prisoners of war working as slave labourers. So yes, the body count is quite high. And
more than 56.
More than 56.
It is amazing. This is a film in which I counted 4 Germans appear. Yeah. In the flooding scene, you see 4 Germans scrambling up a ladder at a distance. And they may not be Germans, they may be Russians for all we know. And that's it.
But this is the other problem, other than the dog, which Peter Jackson is going to have if he comes to remake this film. That fundamentally, you're right, the film is the message of, here's an hour of clever British people using brains and cunning to design a really clever weapon. Then here's an hour of pluck and daring as they deliver the weapon and achieve their aims, and huzzah, now we all go home for teas and medals. What the weapon was designed to do was to blow up dams and flood areas to hit industrial production and kill a lot of civilians. This is fundamentally a film celebrating in the planning and execution of what, had the war gone the other way, we would call a war crime.
So this is the judgment at Nuremberg question, is are we watching a war? I mean, this is the problem with the entire bomber offensive.
Yeah.
It is also interesting to me that I think the only date that we see in the film is early 1942. At the start of it, it says early 1942. It actually... And you can, if you're watching closely, you realise that lots of times Wallis is spending 5 months trying to work out how to bounce the bombs. And it's kind of, Chastise happens in mid-43. Early 1942, Britain, there is obviously a historical inevitabilist argument about this, but the war is not going Britain's way in early 1942. We'd keep being beaten in places. A Churchill line that before El Alamein, which is second half of 42, there were only defeats, and afterwards there were only victories. By putting it then... I wonder if that is an attempt to say this started when things were going quite badly, and this is sort of the interesting line. I don't know if you read Max Hastings' Bomber Command, terrific book. There's a long period where if you're in Britain and you want to hit Germany, who you are at war with, the only way you can do it is by bombing them. There is this war going on in the desert, but it's slightly weird and distant, and you're fighting over sand. And the bomber offensive is the one thing that the British government has got to say, look, we're punching the Germans every night. And almost immediately after the war, you can sense that they're starting to think, Hamburg. These things that yes, if the war goes the other way, the sort of judgment at Coventry or something is Bomber Harris is definitely on trial.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one that... in terms of the bomber offensive, strategic bombing, as we call it, sort of big area bombing. If this was more precise, the Operation Chastise, but this big bomber offensive. I mean, it's interesting that even now, sort of 70 years after the war, it really divides even military historians about how effective it was. In that, you got some historians who think this was really important in breaking the back of the German war effort and economic production, which contributed to defeat on the battlefield. And you've got other historians who argue the entire thing was, very ineffectual and killed a lot of people, but didn't actually damage the war effort. I mean, what's really important, after the war, you've got the strategic bombing survey, when you get all of the engineers going out to Germany and trying to work out, was this anywhere near? What you see straight away is, they thought they were doing a lot more damage, 42, 43, 44, 45, than they were when you actually go, in 46 and look on the ground.
Yes.
And
there's also this issue of what they call, there's a sort of the economic bombing and there's morale bombing.
Yeah.
The oddest thing about the idea that you can bomb people until they give up is that they know this hasn't worked in London.
Yes.
Which actually he says, Wallis says this in the film, at the start of the film, that doesn't work. Again, the interesting thing about this film is to what extent is this in 1955, the government and the RAF trying to say, look, here's a good bit of the bombing war.
Yes.
That we're, it's clever and it's ingenious, and only 4 Germans die. The way they deal with it is just simply not to mention it. And as you say, the Peter Jackson's problem is immediately, sort of what are you doing with those people on the ground? The Cooler King Award for the most gratuitous American character. There is Joe McCarthy. Oh, yes, the American. I know this because I wrote it down. You don't see him. You don't hear. Guy Gibson has a Canadian in his crew.
Yeah.
But, I mean, basically, so this is the other thing about this film is this is Britain winning the war.
Oh, yes, it's very, very British.
Yeah. British men.
British
supported
brains.
by British women with British cocoa. But absolutely in no sense did we need... I mean, there was Joe McCarthy is there. I presume that Joe McCarthy is real and was... I'm assuming that all of these names are real. But basically, there are no Americans in this. We don't care if the American box is...
Did this film ever do well in the States? Or is this is interesting. Is it a very British film?
It is a very British film. So it was released in the States, and in order to spice it up, and I think that this is in the cut that we both saw. One of the odd things about this is there are various cuts of this film floating about, largely because of the dog, but also for other reasons. They added a plane crashing into a mountainside for the American audience, and there is, in the cut that is on Amazon, which is, I think, the Studio Canal cut, there is a plane crashing into the mountainside in the distance, and that did not happen in the operation.
No, and I sort of love that as well. It's clearly a production meeting somewhere. Oh, it's a very British film. Will the Americans be interested? Maybe Americans like plane crashes. Throw in a plane crash, then ram them into their seats.
That apparently, if that is the one that we have, that apparently is a B-24 crashing or something. It's from a different film. It's this thing. One of the great things about war films is the extent to which they borrow bits of footage from other war films. But yes, no, I mean, basically there are no gratuitous Americans in this. Who's in this in a tiny part who went on to be a legend? My nomination is Patrick McGoohan, later of The Prisoner, who is outside the briefing room. He's the one who tells the dog, you can't go in. And he doesn't use the dog's name, which is why he went on to be a star. Even then, he could spot the problem. He's bought it, Sarge. Best death.
Who's your nomination?
My nomination is the dog.
Oh, well, yes.
I think, because actually, there's this... The importance of the dog, in a sense, is Gibson dealing with...
The loss of men in his fortune.
The loss of men, and it's it's kind of a prefiguring the moment where he's told, and his lip wobbles, that's beloved dog. And actually, they spend more on the death of the dog than they do on any of the planes. I mean, you see the planes going down, and this seems to me plausible. Actually, they see the planes going down, and they look and they see somebody. The guy to the left has just been shot down.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah.
So the death rate in Bomber Command is something like casualty rate, something like 50%.
Yeah.
Over the course of the war.
It's British and American Bomber Command and German U-boat service. I mean, they're your three places you do not want to serve.
And indeed, Guy Gibson, who is the hero of this film, will die the following year. Best meme. It's not a very memeable, but I quite like the engine starting up. I actually quite like also the moment where Guy Gibson's team, who are supposed to be going on leave, tell him they want to come with him for his special mission. And there's just a little close-up of him smiling proudly. And I sort of thought, if I could have that as a GIF, I would use that, but I don't think anyone would know what it was. It's sort of,
if any listeners want to make a series of GIFs for Rob,
and then send them to me on whatever has replaced Twitter. Stiffest upper lip. I'm going for Guy Gibson learning that his dog has been killed.
Yeah.
That's I mean, and then the end, which is also the sort of the best quote.
But save that. Save that.
Yeah. Nastiest Nazi. There are no Nazis in this film.
Makes it much easier. But you step back. I mean, it is phenomenal. You can make this genre-defining war film in which the enemy just don't appear.
And actually, I mean, this is something I'm actually in the book I'm writing at the moment. I'm slightly wrestling with. Is you very much have sort of one side of something. Yeah. So, what is the antagonist? For the antagonist for Barnes Wallis is physics.
Yes.
Basically, it's can you make this bomb bounce?
Yeah.
The antagonist in the first half for 617 Squadron is aeronautics. Can you fly this low? Can you fly this level? And the antagonist for the second half is, well, it's slightly physics and aeronautics, and there is anti-aircraft fire and pylons.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the actual operation, 2 of the planes are brought down by pylons.
Yeah.
I mean, if you count the flak fire as nature, which it almost is in this film, because you never see a gunner,
But it reminds me in that way of, the Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk.
Yes.
Is another film about, another film about the Second World War, which you basically don't see the enemy. You can see the odd bit of German aircraft. You see the odd bit of German fire. You see a few German fighters at the end. You don't see a German. You can make a war movie without the enemy, it turns out, and it's more common than you'd think.
Yes, yeah. I think this is extraordinary. I mean, at least you see Stukas in Dunkirk, and you see Messerschmitts.
Yeah.
There's just tracer fire.
Yeah.
In this, loose lips, best lines. I think I'm going for The one that actually I realise sticks in the mind is when Barnes Wallis is asking for a Wellington, and they say, well, why would we give you one? He says, well, if you told them I had designed it, do you think that might help?
Very good line, which interestingly, this is 10 years after the war. That is a line almost certainly put in for the purposes of, dramatic license.
Yes, because it's not quite true.
No,
he had worked on it.
He'd worked in design, yeah. But it's interesting that, even in a very, very government-backed film 10 years after the war, you're prepared to play a little bit fast and loose with just to spice up the story.
So there is a theme in all of these things, and again, this goes to the book I'm writing, which at some point I will talk about endlessly on this because there are films that we can talk about. This idea that you have to have sort of government resistance to whizzy ideas, and you see this in all of these things that somebody's got a whizzy idea and government's against it, but almost always, and then you get Churchill on board and it's fine. Apparently, Barnes Wallis said there was no government resistance, and in fact, I have to say, in the thing I'm writing about, everyone in the hierarchy is absolutely up for whizzy ideas.
Yeah.
They have you got a whizzy idea? Because we're a bit stuck. We'll take your whizzy ideas. But yes, so the other antagonist is other men in suits.
Yeah.
Although not, I mean, there's one man in suits. Well, there's one real doubter in suits in this. But Enemy Coast Ahead, which was the name of Guy Gibson. I wouldn't mind that as a meme if the gift makers out there. That's the name of his book. But I think probably the last words which are in fact the last words of the film. The famous last words are, "I have to write some letters first."
Yeah, and again, it's stiff upper lip moment again as well, isn't it? Yeah, it's. Should we be celebrating? No, I have to write letters to the family of the crew who... And it's also how they deal with it. During the mission, it's just, a plane's gone down. We don't have time to even deal with this, to process it. We just have to get on and do it. But then as soon as you're back, it's... dealing with those planes going down is the first priority rather than celebrating. It's very duty first.
The victims in this film are very much the aircrew who are shot down. Again, there is absolutely no sense that sort of anyone is at all bothered by. It's a military target.
Yeah,
and to be honest, the RAF did worse things than hit the dams. And actually, you can make a case that towards the end of the war, they're trying to close factories not by blowing up dams, but by blowing up the people who work in the factories. And at least in this one, if you want to get into moral relativism, the civilians are incidental to blowing up the dams that will Broadsword Radio Award for completely implausible moments. I think this is pretty. I mean, it's certainly faithful to the technology as you say, as it was understood at that point. Judgment at Nuremberg. We've discussed how many war crimes are committed. There's an essay question there.
Really, there is. There is.
They didn't make very much.
An essay question sort of skirted around in the film itself.
Yes,
but an essay question
they do talk about it a bit, in the sense of they talk about the effectiveness and bombing and so on.
Yeah.
I did find myself thinking, you've got Barnes Wallis, who is the perfect, sort of home life, cottage existence, and what he is doing is. There's a flip side of this where Barnes Wallis is a hideous monster who is sort of sitting on his sofa plotting the deaths of thousands of civilians.
Whilst enjoying his tea and having his Coca-Cola and having his socks down.
Worth dying for? Does this stand up on repeated viewing?
Yeah, I think it does. And like I say, last night was the first time I'd watched it in, 7, 8, 9 years probably. You remember all of the key moments. There's bits you forget. We'll not go there again. And there's bits you forget. But it works really well. And you particularly see, I've watched a lot of Star Wars over the last few years with my kids, and you really do see in that last hour how this has just invented that genre of how we show air-to-air combat or planes flying around, and everyone has at least sort of nodded to or explicitly copied for the following 70 odd years.
I mean, I think I chewed through my pencil in that last hour of the bombing run. And partly I think it does help that I was sitting there thinking, apart from the plane flying into the mountainside, this is accurate. So from a screenwriting point of view, how many times do you sort of hit the dam? How many times do you miss the dam before you blow the dam up? You'd probably blow the dam up on the last bomb, you know, and you have some... I assume that this is... That this accurately reflects how many times you have to bomb a dam to blow it up. And that somehow actually sort of made it even more nail-bitingly tense. And
it's so well shot as well.
Yes.
I mean, this is the thing. It's a beautiful film to look at. And I think often when you see these black and white films, the cinematography is just as important, and the lighting is just as important as the direction. And the lighting in this is perfect. And just, I don't even know how you go about getting the lighting so right when you're filming aeroplanes in 1955.
Well, and the silences back at Mission Control.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a fantastic moment where Barnes Wallis is sitting there, and one of the RAF officers comes over to say something to him, and then walks away because he can't think of anything to say. And all of that is so well done. It conveys... I mean, again, this is a film about British aircrew and British and Empire aircrew and Joe McCarthy, the American. And the beforehand, the long shots of them getting ready, where you sort of think, why are we being shown, these two chaps sitting and reading the paper? And it's about how do you prepare yourself to go on a mission when you know at this point that not all of you are coming back. They're sitting in the briefing room, and they know that some of them will be dead within 24 hours, a lot of them. And then afterwards, when it cuts back to the bedrooms with the clock slowly winding down and the letter left for the loved ones and so on, that's incredibly well done.
Duncan, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes.
100% on Rotten Tomatoes. Duncan, is this the operation that changed the course of World War II?
No, but this one does have a better claim than some others. So it was a very effective raid. It did what it set out to do. It hit German coal production really highly. For Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, who is, I think it's fair to say,
he's a nasty Nazi.
Yeah, very nasty.
Yeah. I mean, not in this, but he'd win.
Yeah, very, very unreliable witness in many ways. But he did say afterwards, as armaments minister at the time, this raid achieved more in one night than months of previous bombing had. So, big impact. It doesn't win the war, but it is an important operation.
The Dam Busters. That was A Pod Too Far with me, Robert Hutton, and Duncan Weldon. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, and if you liked it, rate and review us. You can drop us a line at podtoofar@gmail.com or on Twitter @podtoofar. If you want to watch along with us, next time we're doing Duncan's favourite naval movie, The Battle of the River Plate.